In the summer of 1878, when typhoid fever claimed the lives of 47 residents in Harper County, Kansas, an immunity that defied medical explanation was displayed by four brothers named Blackwood. But their survival came at a cost so grotesque that 3 different physicians refused to document their findings, and all records related to the case were quietly sealed by the Kansas State Medical Board. What started as divine protection became something far more sinister. A transformation so disturbing that every mention of the Blackwood family was burned from their records by the local Methodist Church. Symptoms that no medical textbook had ever described were developed by the brothers. Symptoms that grew progressively more inhuman with each passing day. By winter, that the brothers no longer cast proper shadows was reported by neighbors. Their voices had taken on harmonic qualities that made listeners' ears bleed, and light was reflected in their eyes like those of nocturnal predators. The phrase, "subjects have transcended human biological classification before all documentation was permanently sealed," was allegedly contained in the final medical report, classified to this day. Tonight, after nearly 150 years of silence, we're about to uncover why modern science still refuses to acknowledge what happened on that isolated farm and why the truth about the Blackwood brothers might be more terrifying than any supernatural explanation. Before the story of Ezra, Caleb, Josiah, and Abel Blackwood continues, I need to ask you something important. This channel isn't for everyone, only for the bravest souls who dare to uncover the mysteries that others fear to tell. If you're one of those true mystery seekers, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments what state or city you're listening from. Are you brave enough to learn what really happened when faith and science collided on the Kansas prairie? Now, let's step back into 1878, where faith and fear walked hand in hand. The small farming community of Cedar Ridge, Kansas, existed as little more than a crossroads between wheat fields and cattle ranches in the late 1870s. With barely 300 souls scattered across the windswept prairie, it was the kind of place where everyone knew their neighbor's business, where a man's word was his bond, and where Sunday worship at the Methodist Church served as both spiritual guidance and social gathering. The harsh winters that brought blizzards capable of burying entire homesteads, and the scorching summers that could kill crops in a single week had forged a population of stoic, God-fearing people who viewed hardship as divine testing, and prosperity as heavenly blessing. The landscape itself seemed to encourage such thinking. Miles of golden wheat stretched to every horizon, broken only by the occasional farmhouse, windmill, or grove of cottonwood trees marking a creek bed. The sky dominated everything, vast, endless, and ever-changing. During thunderstorms, lightning would dance across the prairie for hours, illuminating the grassland in brief, brilliant flashes that revealed the true isolation of each homestead. In winter, the wind howled across the flatland with a voice that sounded almost human, carrying snow and cold that could freeze a man to death in minutes if he lost his way between barn and house. In the spring of 1872, the Blackwood brothers had arrived in Cedar Ridge, purchasing 640 acres of prime prairie land with money inherited from their father's farm back in Clinton County, Ohio. Everything they owned had been sold by the brothers, their belongings loaded into 2 covered wagons, and the journey west made with the determination of men following a divine calling. Ezra Blackwood, the eldest at 36 when they arrived, possessed the natural authority of a man accustomed to leadership and responsibility. Standing 6 foot tall with broad shoulders built by years of farm work, he carried himself with quiet dignity that commanded respect without demanding it. Countless hours of labor had scarred his weathered hands, which could gentle a spooked horse or guide a plow with equal skill. But it was his eyes that people remembered most, pale blue like winter ice. They seemed to look right through a person to something deeper. Those who spoke with Ezra often came away feeling that he had seen straight into their soul and found them wanting. Caleb, 2 years younger than Ezra, served as the family's practical mind and business manager. Where Ezra led through moral authority, Caleb managed through careful planning and mathematical precision. Grain yields, livestock prices, and weather patterns could be calculated by him with an accuracy that impressed even the most experienced farmers in the county. Every penny earned and spent, every bushel harvested, every head of cattle bought or sold was tracked in his ledger books, kept in meticulous handwriting. But beneath his practical exterior burned the same intense faith that motivated all the brothers. God's hand was seen by Caleb in everything, in the perfect geometry of a wheat field, in the precise timing of rainfall, in the mathematical harmony that governed the natural world. The most formal education of the four had been received by Josiah, the third brother, at 31. For 2 years he had attended Ohio Wesleyan University before their father's death called him back to the family farm. During those years, he had studied not only theology, but also medicine, philosophy, and natural sciences. Over 200 volumes covering subjects from biblical commentary to human anatomy were contained in his personal library, carefully transported to Kansas in a specially built crate. A scholar's study more than a farmer's quarters was resembled by Josiah's room in the farmhouse, with books stacked on every available surface and papers covered with his careful notes filling wooden boxes beneath his bed. Abel, the youngest at 25, burned with religious fervor that sometimes concerned even his faith-driven siblings. Where the older brothers approached their devotion with scholarly depth or practical application, Abel's faith was pure emotion and absolute surrender. Hours each day were spent by him in prayer, often weeping with the intensity of his communion with the divine. He fasted regularly, sometimes going days without food, while claiming that prayer and scripture provided all the sustenance he needed. Touched by the Spirit was what his fellow church members back in Ohio had called him. But some had whispered that his devotion bordered on dangerous obsession. Unlike their neighbors who attended the Methodist church in town, a modest white-painted building with a bell tower that could be heard for miles across the prairie, their own chapel had been constructed by the Blackwood brothers on a hill overlooking their property. The better part of their first year in Kansas had been taken by the building project. Limestone had been quarried by them from a creek bed on their land, oak timber cut from a grove near the property line, and every piece of the structure crafted with their own hands. Their austere but deeply felt faith was reflected in the chapel they built. The structure measured 30 feet by 20 feet with walls of precisely fitted limestone and a roof of hand-split oak shingles. Local walnut wood had been carved by them into pews inside, each one perfectly smooth and fitted with careful joinery that spoke of hours of patient craftsmanship. Inscriptions in Hebrew that Josiah had copied from his biblical texts were borne by the altar, also hand-carved. The morning and evening sun was caught by tall windows on the east and west walls, filling the space with golden light during their dawn and dusk prayers. Their own services were held by the brothers every Sunday morning and evening following what they called primitive Methodist principles. A stricter interpretation of Wesley's teachings that emphasized personal revelation, direct communion with the divine and the priesthood of all believers. Longer periods of silent prayer, extensive biblical study, and what they called testimony of the Spirit, where each brother would share any divine revelations or insights he had received during the week, were included in their services. Their commitment to both faith and labor was reflected in their daily routine. Each morning at 4 o'clock they rose for an hour of silent prayer in the chapel, watching the sun rise over the eastern prairie while they communed individually with God. After a simple breakfast of bread, milk, and whatever fruit was in season, the morning would be spent by them working their fields. The afternoon hours were devoted to animal care, equipment maintenance, and the countless tasks required to keep a farm operational. But evening was always reserved for spiritual pursuits, Bible study, theological discussion, and group prayer that often lasted until well after midnight. As bachelors the brothers lived, dedicating themselves entirely to their faith and their land, though this decision had not been without cost. Their utilitarian approach to life and their deep religious commitment was reflected in their farmhouse, a sturdy 2-story structure they had built during their second year in Kansas. Biblical verses carved into wooden plaques were displayed on the walls. Each one selected for its relevance to daily farm life and spiritual growth. At least one well-worn Bible was contained in every room, and several had additional religious texts that Josiah had determined were worthy of regular study. By the summer of 1878, a model of agricultural success and spiritual dedication had been become by the Blackwood farm. Golden across the prairie stretched their wheat fields. Contentedly on healthy grassland grazed their cattle, their silo bulged with grain, and their chapel stood as a testament to their unwavering faith. Everything they had hoped for when they left Ohio 6 years earlier had been achieved by the brothers. prosperity, independence, and the freedom to worship according to their deepest convictions. The Blackwood brothers were respected by their neighbors in Cedar Ridge, though many found their intensity unsettling, and their isolation from community life puzzling. The brothers were known for their honesty in business dealings, their willingness to help neighbors in times of crisis, and their reputation for hard work and fair treatment of the occasional hired hands they employed during harvest season. But they were also known for their unwillingness to participate in social gatherings, their refusal to engage in casual conversations, and their habit of evaluating everyone they met with those penetrating blue eyes that seemed to see straight through to a person's soul. When the brothers came to town for supplies, which they did every 2 weeks with military precision, they moved with quiet purpose and spoke only when necessary. A carefully prepared list would be arrived with at the general store, their business conducted with polite efficiency, and departure made without engaging in the social pleasantries that other farmers enjoyed. In fascination at the 4 identical beards, perfectly trimmed and coal black, that gave the brothers an almost biblical appearance, children often stared. On July 15, 1878, the first case of typhoid fever appeared in Cedar Ridge. Striking with the sudden violence that characterized the most virulent strains of the disease, Mrs. Sarah Hartman, who ran the general store with her husband, Benjamin, had seemed perfectly healthy when she opened the store that morning, greeting customers with her usual cheerful demeanor and discussing the promising prospects for the wheat harvest. But by afternoon she was burning with fever, her skin covered with the characteristic rose-colored spots that experienced physicians recognized as the mark of typhoid. From his rounds at the Henderson farm, Dr. Samuel Morrison, the county's only physician, had been summoned, where he had been delivering a breech birth that had taken most of the day. He arrived at the Hartman store to find Sarah delirious with fever, her temperature so high that it barely registered on his clinical thermometer. Benjamin, her husband, a normally calm and practical man, was pacing the store like a caged animal, wringing his hands and begging Dr. Morrison to do something, anything, to save his wife of 23 years. "She was fine this morning," Benjamin kept repeating, his voice cracking with desperation. "Fine as she's ever been. Served breakfast to the Henderson boys when they came for supplies. Laughed at something young Tommy said about his new foal. How does a person go from healthy to this in the space of a few hours?" Typhoid before had been seen by Dr. Morrison during his medical training in Philadelphia, but nothing quite like this. Over days or weeks the disease typically developed, giving physicians time to attempt treatment and families time to prepare for the likely outcome. But the entire progression of the disease seemed to have been compressed into a single devastating day by Sarah Hartman's case. Higher than he had ever recorded in a living patient was her fever. Her delirium was complete and violent, and the rose-colored spots covered not just her chest, but her entire body in patterns that seemed almost deliberate in their symmetry. Despite Dr. Morrison's best efforts, cold compresses, laudanum for the pain and careful monitoring of her vital signs, just after midnight on July 16, Sarah Hartman died. But even in death, her case remained deeply troubling. Far too quickly set in the rigidity of her body. A waxy pallor that suggested preservation rather than normal decomposition was taken on by her skin, and her eyes, which Dr. Morrison had closed according to proper procedure, kept opening again no matter how many times he pressed the lids shut. Within 24 hours of Sarah's death, 3 more cases appeared in Cedar Ridge. Nothing in common seemed to be had by the victims except their use of water from the town's main well, a source that had provided clean, sweet water for the community since its founding. But when Dr. Morrison examined the well, evidence of contamination from runoff that had somehow breached the carefully constructed stone lining was found by him. The second victim was old Heinrich Zimmermann, a German immigrant who had farmed the same section of land for 15 years. The same devastating pattern as Sarah's was followed by Heinrich's case. Perfect health in the morning, raging fever by afternoon, and death before dawn. But something that Dr. Morrison had never encountered marked Heinrich's final hours. In languages that no one in the community recognized spoke the old farmer, using words and phrases that sounded ancient and somehow threatening. The Patterson twins, Emma and Ellen, were the third and fourth victims. 2 16-year-old girls who had been among the most promising students in the county's single schoolhouse. Particularly heartbreaking were their deaths because they occurred simultaneously, as if the disease had coordinated its attack to claim both girls at exactly the same moment. That in their final delirium, the twins had spoken in perfect unison, reciting what sounded like prayers in a language that resembled Latin, but contained sounds that human throats should not have been able to produce, was later told to Dr. Morrison by their father, James Patterson. By August 1, 14 people had died from the strange typhoid strain, and symptoms and progressions that defied every principle of medical science he had learned had been documented by Dr. Morrison. Within 24 hours of showing symptoms died all the victims. Temperatures that should have killed them within minutes were reached by their fevers, and delirium that seemed more like possession than medical crisis marked their final hours. Unlike anything the community had ever experienced was the fear that gripped Cedar Ridge during those terrible weeks in late July and early August. In their homes, families barricaded themselves, refusing to venture out except for the most essential tasks. A place of whispered conversations and furtive glances became the general store, now run by Benjamin Hartman with the help of his brother-in-law. The Methodist Church, which had always served as the community's gathering place and source of comfort, stood nearly empty during Sunday services, as people feared that any congregation might provide the disease with new victims. The contaminated well had been ordered sealed by Dr. Morrison, and all residents advised to boil their water. But with a pattern that suggested something more than simple contamination, the disease continued to spread. According to some logic that had nothing to do with their exposure to the well water or their proximity to previous cases, the victims seemed to be chosen. Every member was lost by some families while neighboring households remained completely healthy. Against this backdrop of terror and confusion was made the Blackwood brothers' fateful decision to involve themselves in the crisis. On their farm, the brothers had remained isolated during the early weeks of the epidemic, following their usual practice of avoiding unnecessary contact with the town and its residents. But on August 10, that he had received what he believed was a divine revelation calling them to action was announced to his brothers by Josiah. "I have prayed for guidance," Josiah told his brothers as they gathered for their evening meal. "And the Lord has shown me that this pestilence is a test not just of the community's faith, but of our own worthiness to serve as his instruments. From the disease we have been preserved not for our own safety but so that we might demonstrate the power of true faith in the face of ultimate trial." Once made, the decision was implemented with the same methodical precision that characterized everything the brothers did. On August 11, to offer their assistance to Dr. Morrison and to volunteer their services in caring for the sick was traveled to town by Josiah. But his real purpose, which he revealed only to his brothers, was to place himself in direct contact with the disease, to invite it to test his faith and prove his worthiness as an instrument of divine will. The home of Thomas Fletcher, the local blacksmith, whose 8-year-old son, Timothy, had fallen ill the previous night, was Josiah's first stop. The boy was burning with fever, his small body racked with convulsions that his parents were powerless to stop. When Josiah arrived, the Fletcher family gathered around Timothy's bed, praying desperately for divine intervention, was found by him. Differently by everyone who witnessed it would be remembered what happened next, but all agreed that Josiah's actions were both deeply moving and somehow disturbing. Beside Timothy's bed knelt the youngest Blackwood brother and placed his hands on the boy's fever-hot forehead. But instead of offering a conventional prayer for the child's recovery, words that would haunt everyone present were spoken by Josiah. "Lord God," Josiah prayed, his voice carrying across the small bedroom with unusual resonance. "If this child must suffer for reasons known only to your divine wisdom, then let that suffering pass through me and my brothers. Let us bear what he cannot bear, experience what he should not experience, and become whatever we must become to serve your mysterious purposes. Take this innocent life and spare it through our willing sacrifice." As Josiah spoke, warm against Timothy's forehead seemed to grow his hands, and gradually subsided the boy's convulsions. The fever that had been consuming the child's small body began to break, and for the first time in hours, Timothy Fletcher opened his eyes and spoke in his normal voice, asking for water and complaining of hunger. So dramatic and sudden was the transformation that Thomas Fletcher fell to his knees, praising God for the miracle that had saved his son. But changes that were far more subtle, but somehow more disturbing than Timothy's recovery were noticed by those who watched Josiah during those crucial minutes. As the boy's fever broke, a flush that suggested his body temperature was rising had been taken on by Josiah's own skin. His eyes, normally the same pale blue that characterized all the Blackwood brothers, began to show flecks of gold that seemed to move and shift like liquid metal. When Josiah finally stood up from Timothy's bedside, with the careful precision of a man who was fighting to maintain control over his own body, he moved. With growing confusion and concern, Dr. Morrison, who had been summoned to witness what the Fletchers were calling a miracle, examined both Timothy and Josiah. No trace of typhoid fever was shown by the boy, but early symptoms that were already progressing far more rapidly than should have been medically possible were displayed by Josiah. Over the following 2 days, every household that had been touched by the epidemic was visited by Josiah, offering prayers and spiritual comfort to the bereaved families. At each stop, the same ritual was repeated by him, placing his hands on the heads of the sick and praying for their suffering to be transferred to himself and his brothers. Remarkable and terrifying in equal measure were the results. In household after household, sudden and complete recoveries were experienced by fever-stricken victims. But with each healing, more rapidly deteriorated Josiah's own condition. By August 13, when he finally returned to the Blackwood farm, Josiah was burning with fever and displaying symptoms that no medical textbook had ever described. But his continued insistence that everything was proceeding according to divine plan was the most disturbing aspect. Even as his fever climbed to temperatures that should have killed him, with perfect clarity about the sacred nature of his transformation he spoke. "This is not sickness," he told his increasingly concerned brothers, "this is purification. The Lord is burning away everything in me that is merely human so that what remains will be worthy of the eternal work He has planned for us." Within hours, the same symptoms that had transformed Josiah had begun to be displayed by all 4 Blackwood brothers. But even more disturbing than anyone could have imagined would prove to be their collective transformation. The most significant and troubling case of his medical career would become Dr. Morrison's first examination of the Blackwood brothers on August 18, 1878. Oppressive was the August heat as Dr. Morrison guided his horse cart up the winding dirt road that led to the Blackwood farm. From weeks without rain the prairie grass on either side of the path had turned brown, and with heat waves that made the distant farmhouse seem to float like a mirage, the air shimmered. But as he approached the property, details that struck him as oddly out of place were noticed by Morrison. The brothers' wheat fields, which should have been suffering from the drought like every other farm in the county, stood tall and green as if they had been receiving regular rainfall. Healthy and well-fed appeared the cattle in the pastures, despite the fact that grazing had become difficult throughout the region. When Morrison knocked on the farmhouse door, by Ezra it was opened. But immediately as profoundly wrong struck the doctor the eldest brother's appearance. A translucent quality that revealed the network of blood vessels beneath had been taken on by Ezra's skin. But the blood that flowed through those vessels was not the normal red of human circulation. Instead, a golden luminescence that seemed to pulse with its own internal rhythm was possessed by it. "Dr. Morrison," Ezra said, and his voice carried the authority Morrison remembered, but it was amplified and enriched with harmonic overtones that made every word seem to resonate directly in the listener's chest cavity. "We have been expecting you. Our transformation is nearly complete, and we require your witness to ensure that others will understand what has occurred here." In the main room of the farmhouse Morrison found the 4 brothers arranged. Their bodies positioned with mathematical precision that suggested careful planning rather than random placement. They were alive. Their chests rose and fell with breathing. Their eyes tracked Morrison's movement, but in ways that challenged his understanding of human physiology. They had been transformed. "Impossible are their vital signs," Morrison wrote in his private journal that night. "Ezra's temperature registered 107 degrees, yet he sits upright and speaks with perfect clarity. So slow is Caleb's pulse I can barely detect it. Yet, with normal energy he moves. Changed is Josiah's breathing. He seems to inhale and exhale only once every few minutes, but shows no signs of oxygen deprivation. And actually lower than normal is Abel's skin temperature despite his obvious fever symptoms." Equally dramatic but different in their specific manifestation were the changes undergone by Caleb, positioned to Ezra's right. The characteristic rose-colored spots of typhoid fever covered his entire body. But instead of the random pattern typical of the disease, into complex geometric designs that resembled mathematical equations written in flesh and blood, they had arranged themselves. As Morrison watched in fascination and horror, slowly shifted and changed the pattern as if Caleb's skin had become a living blackboard. "The calculations are becoming clear," Caleb said, his voice joining Ezra's in perfect harmony despite the fact that they were speaking simultaneously. "The relationship between matter and spirit, between time and eternity, between human limitation and divine potential. We are becoming the proof of theorems that human mathematics has only begun to glimpse." Along lines that reflected his scholarly nature and deep theological knowledge had progressed Josiah's transformation. Recognizably human in its basic structure remained his body, but the appearance of ancient parchment covered with writing in scripts that Morrison recognized as Latin, Greek, and Hebrew, along with other symbols that seemed to shift and change even as he watched, was taken on by his skin. When Josiah spoke, in a voice that no longer sounded entirely human came his words. From multiple points around the room simultaneously seemed to originate the sound, creating an effect that made Morrison feel as if he were being addressed by a choir of invisible speakers. "Doctor, we have discovered truths that your medical science cannot accommodate. We are documenting these revelations so that future generations might understand the process of divine transformation." The most visually striking transformation of all had been undergone by Abel, the youngest brother. A soft phosphorescent glow that provided illumination for the room's interior was emanated by his entire body. Harsh or unpleasant was not the light, but profoundly unnatural it was. A cool blue-white radiance that seemed to come from within his very bones. Completely luminous had become his eyes, lacking pupils or irises, appearing instead as twin stars set in a human face. "We no longer require food as sustenance," Abel said, his words somehow reaching Morrison's ears from both inside the room and from what seemed like a great distance. "We draw our energy directly from sources that human science has not yet discovered. We are becoming something new, something that exists between the mortal and eternal realms." Resistance from the brothers themselves was met by Morrison's attempts to document his findings. That their condition was a divine gift, a sign that God had chosen them for a special purpose, was claimed by them. Of being refined by holy fire and transformed into vessels worthy of the Lord's work they spoke. But something far different was told to Dr. Morrison by his medical training. No known disease was resembled by the brothers' symptoms, and either mass hysteria or something more sinister was suggested by their collective transformation. That they had been exposed to some unknown toxin, possibly from their well water or from contaminated grain in their silo, he began to suspect. Mixed and increasingly tense was the community's reaction to the brothers' condition. As miraculous was viewed their survival by some residents led by Reverend Marcus Thorne of the Methodist Church. Pilgrimages to the Blackwood farm began to be made by them, hoping to witness divine intervention firsthand. Disturbing and unnatural was found the brothers' transformation by others, particularly those who had lost family members to the epidemic. "It ain't right," muttered Jacob Steinberg, who had buried his wife and 2 children in the space of a week. "Why should they be spared when good Christian folk are dying? And look at them. That ain't no blessing I can see. There's something wrong with those boys. Something that makes my skin crawl just looking at them." The community's unease was only intensified by the brothers' behavior during this period. Their fields were continued to be worked by them despite their condition, moving with an eerie coordination that suggested they were communicating without words. Seeing them standing motionless in their wheat fields for hours at a time was reported by neighbors. Their faces turned toward the sky as if listening to some inaudible voice. Particularly unsettling became the changes in their chapel services. Privately the brothers had always conducted their worship, but now across the prairie during their evening prayers could be heard their voices. Hauntingly beautiful was the sound, yet profoundly wrong. For voices harmonizing in ways that human vocal cords should not have been able to produce. That she had approached the chapel one evening to investigate the strange music was later told Dr. Morrison by Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, who lived on the neighboring farm. "I got within 50 yards of that building," she said, "and I swear on my mother's grave that I could feel something pushing me back. Not physically, you understand, but something inside my head telling me to turn around and leave. Those boys are changed, Doctor. Changed in ways that ain't natural." As August turned to September, in Cedar Ridge began to wane the typhoid epidemic. The contaminated well had been sealed, new water sources established, and slowly to their normal routines returned the surviving residents. But with each passing day deepened the mystery of the Blackwood brothers. Weekly visits to the farm were made by Dr. Morrison, ostensibly to monitor the brothers' condition, but actually to document the progression of their transformation. His understanding of human physiology was challenged by what he observed and left him questioning his own sanity. At 106.7 degrees Fahrenheit had stabilized Ezra's internal temperature. Yet no signs of brain damage or organ failure were shown by him. A golden hue that seemed to shift and swirl like liquid metal had been developed by his eyes. When he spoke, a weight and authority that made listeners feel compelled to agree with him, even when he said things that defied logic, was carried by his words. "Dr. Morrison," Ezra said during one examination, "you are attempting to measure us using instruments designed for ordinary human physiology. We have moved beyond the limitations that such tools were created to assess. Our bodies now function according to principles that your medical science has not yet discovered." Continued to evolve had Caleb's rose-colored spots, forming increasingly complex patterns that resembled ancient scripts. Several scholars by correspondence were consulted by Dr. Morrison, sending careful drawings of the markings, but none could identify the symbols. More disturbing still, slowly across Caleb's skin seemed to move the patterns, rearranging themselves into new configurations every few days. When Morrison attempted to take a blood sample from Caleb's arm, that the brother's blood had been transformed into something that barely resembled normal human circulation was discovered by him. Thicker than blood, golden in color, and seemed to move with deliberate purpose rather than responding to gravity and pressure was the substance that flowed from the small puncture wound. "Our circulation has been redesigned," Caleb explained, watching Morrison's growing confusion with what might have been amusement. "The fluid that sustains us now carries not just oxygen and nutrients, but information and energy from sources that transcend physical matter." Completely inhuman had become Josiah's voice. When he spoke, from everywhere and nowhere at once came the sound, as if the very air around him was vibrating with his words. That conversations with Josiah left him feeling dizzy and disoriented was noted by Dr. Morrison, and he began to suspect that the brother's speech was somehow affecting his brain chemistry. Static decorations were not the texts that covered Josiah's skin, but were actively being written by some invisible force. As Morrison watched, along Josiah's arms and chest appeared new words, forming sentences and paragraphs in real time. A running commentary on Morrison's examination, describing his thoughts and reactions with accuracy that suggested the brother could read his mind, seemed to be the content. "We are becoming books," Josiah said. His multidirectional voice making Morrison's head spin with vertigo. "Living repositories of knowledge that spans both human learning and divine revelation. The transformation is encoding information directly into our physical substance." Stronger had grown Abel's phosphorescence, allowing him to illuminate entire rooms with the pale glow emanating from his skin. But more unsettling was his apparent ability to sense things that should have been beyond human perception. Weather changes days in advance could be predicted by him, lost objects located without searching, and when visitors were approaching the farm long before they became visible seemed to be known by him. During one examination, an ability to perceive things that should have been beyond human sensation was demonstrated by Abel. The contents of Morrison's medical bag without looking inside it were correctly identified by him, in detail described the condition of horses stabled half a mile away, and aware of conversations taking place in the town of Cedar Ridge, 3 miles distant seemed to be. "Our senses have been opened to perceive realities that normal humans cannot detect," Abel explained, his luminous eyes somehow managing to convey warmth despite their otherworldly appearance. "We can see across distances that should be impossible. Hear sounds that carry on frequencies beyond normal hearing." In ways that suggested they were becoming something more than human had also changed the brothers' collective behavior. With perfect synchronization they moved, finishing each other's sentences and responding to unspoken communications. Dramatically had diminished their need for food and sleep. That they consumed perhaps half the calories of normal men and seemed to require only 2 or 3 hours of rest each night was observed by Dr. Morrison. That they were receiving divine revelations was their most disturbing of all claim. Of visions showing them the future of their community, prophecies about coming disasters, and instructions for preparing their neighbors for some unnamed catastrophe spoke the brothers. These revelations began to be written by them in a leather-bound journal using a script that resembled no known language. To fear and suspicion gradually gave way the community's initial curiosity about the brothers' condition. From playing near the Blackwood property children were forbidden, and when they saw the brothers in town adults crossed themselves. From the family began to distance itself the Methodist Church, which had initially celebrated their survival as a miracle. With barely concealed unease now spoke of them Reverend Thorne, who had once praised the brothers' faith. I fear, he confided to Dr. Morrison, that in their zeal to serve the Lord, they may have opened themselves to influences that are not entirely heavenly. There is something in their eyes now, something that looks back at you with knowledge that no mortal man should possess. By October 1878, untenable had become the situation at the Blackwood farm. To the point where they could no longer be considered entirely human had progressed the brothers' transformation. Yet, about their condition they remained lucid and articulate. Of being purified vessels chosen by God to serve as intermediaries between the divine and mortal realms they spoke. Increasingly frantic had become Dr. Morrison's documentation of their condition. A man struggling to maintain his scientific rationalism in the face of phenomena that defied explanation was revealed by his journal entries. With medical colleagues in Kansas City and Chicago he had begun corresponding, seeking advice on the case, but only deepened his frustration their responses. No physician I've consulted has ever encountered anything resembling the Blackwood brothers' condition, he wrote. Physiologically impossible are their symptoms. Yet I observe them with my own eyes. I begin to wonder if I am losing my mind or if there are aspects of human biology that our medical science has yet to discover. On October 15 came the breaking point when young Sarah Preston, the daughter of a local farmer, disappeared while playing near the Blackwood property. Sitting in the brothers' chapel with a serene expression on her face was found by her parents 3 hours later. That the brothers had told her wonderful secrets about heaven and had shown her visions of angels was claimed by her. But when Dr. Morrison examined the child, that her temperature had risen to 103 degrees and her eyes had begun to take on the same golden hue that characterized Ezra's condition was found by him. That Dr. Morrison intervene was demanded by the girl's parents, terrified that their daughter had been infected with whatever had changed the brothers. You have to stop this, Sarah's father, Thomas Preston, pleaded. Those men, or whatever they've become, they're spreading their curse to our children. My little girl keeps talking about joining them in their holy work. She says they've shown her things that number 7-year-old should know about. That she had indeed been affected by her contact with the brothers was revealed by Dr. Morrison's examination of Sarah. Unlike typhoid or any other disease he recognized was her fever, and dramatically had changed her behavior. With wisdom beyond her years she spoke, demonstrated knowledge of medical and theological concepts she couldn't possibly have learned, and with the same phosphorescence that characterized Abel seemed to glow. Faced with the possibility that the brother's condition might be contagious, a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life was made by Dr. Morrison. The Kansas State Medical Board and the Regional Health Authority were contacted by him requesting immediate intervention. But when officials arrived to investigate, so disturbing was the case found by them that they chose to suppress it rather than study it. 3 days at the Blackwood farm in late October were spent by Dr. James Patterson, the state medical examiner. His official report, sealed by the state board, allegedly contained observations that were incompatible with current medical understanding and potentially damaging to public health and safety. Classified was the report and remains sealed to this day. But the true extent of his horror was revealed by Patterson's private letters to his wife, discovered years later. I have seen things, he wrote, that challenge not only our understanding of disease and human physiology, but the very nature of life itself. The Blackwood brothers are no longer entirely human, yet they are not dead. They exist in some intermediate state that our science cannot explain and dare not acknowledge. When several families reported that their children had begun disappearing from their beds at night, only to be found hours later, standing in the field surrounding the Blackwood chapel, came to a head the community's growing unease about the brothers' continued presence. No memory of how they had gotten there was had by the children, but with knowledge and abilities that their parents found deeply disturbing they returned. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, intensifies the horror in Cedar Ridge. If this story is giving you chills, with a friend who loves dark mysteries, share this video. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. On October 25th was convened a town meeting by Mayor William Harrison to address what many residents viewed as a crisis requiring immediate intervention. By nearly every adult in Cedar Ridge was attended the meeting, and a community deeply divided between those who viewed the brothers as blessed healers and those who saw them as dangerous influences was revealed by the discussions. To provide a medical assessment was called upon Dr. Morrison, but only deepened the community's confusion and fear. His testimony. The brothers' condition, as unlike anything in medical literature was described by him, acknowledged that their influence appeared to be spreading to other residents, and admitted that conventional medicine had no treatment to offer. I have observed physiological changes in the Blackwood brothers that challenge our fundamental understanding of human biology, Morrison told the assembled crowd. Their vital signs are consistently abnormal, yet they show no signs of illness. Their capabilities exceed normal human limitations, yet they maintain lucid consciousness. I cannot classify their condition as a disease because they are not suffering. I cannot call it an improvement because it represents a fundamental alteration of human nature. With a decision that would have profound consequences, concluded the meeting. To visit the Blackwood farm and demand that the brothers either reverse the changes they had undergone or leave Cedar Ridge permanently was formed a committee of community leaders. Mayor Harrison, Reverend Thorne, Thomas Preston, and Dr. Morrison would be included in the committee, and an ultimatum requiring the brothers to respond within 1 week would be delivered by them. On November 1, 1878 arrived at the Blackwood farm the delegation from Cedar Ridge under a gray sky that seemed to press down upon the prairie with the weight of impending winter. Alongside Mayor Harrison, Reverend Thorne, and Thomas Preston rode Dr. Morrison. Each man lost in his own thoughts about the confrontation that awaited them. Normal from a distance appeared the farmhouse and outbuildings, but as the delegation drew closer, details that confirmed Morrison's growing conviction that the Blackwood property had become something beyond conventional classification emerged. The wheat fields, which should have been harvested weeks earlier, stood tall and golden despite the approaching winter. With an unnatural coordination moved the cattle in the pastures, grazing in precise patterns that formed geometric shapes when viewed from the elevation of the road. The chapel on the hill was the most unsettling of all. With a faint luminescence that was visible even in daylight seemed to pulse the limestone structure, and from within could be heard emanating the sound of voices. Not the familiar harmonies of Methodist hymns, but something far more complex and otherworldly. When the delegation knocked on the farmhouse door, by young Sarah Preston it was opened, whose presence there shocked her father into momentary speechlessness. Healthy and happy appeared the girl, but more pronounced had grown the golden flecks in her eyes, and the same translucent quality that characterized the brothers' condition had been developed by her skin. "Hello, Papa," Sarah said, her voice carrying the harmonic undertones that had become the signature of the transformation. "The brothers have been expecting you. They're waiting in the chapel, and they're ready to answer all your questions." By phenomena that challenged their understanding of reality itself was marked the delegation's journey to the chapel. With subtle energy seemed to vibrate the ground beneath their feet, and with patterns of light that resembled heat waves, but felt cool to the touch, shimmered the air around them. In formations that defied their natural behavior flew birds, arranging themselves in geometric patterns that shifted and changed as the men walked toward the hill. When they entered the chapel, in a perfect square around the altar found the four Blackwood brothers arranged, their bodies positioned with mathematical precision. A stage that made their previous condition seem almost normal by comparison had been reached by the brothers' transformation. Completely translucent had become their skin, revealing internal structures that bore no resemblance to normal human anatomy. Pools of liquid gold that seemed to contain depths beyond physical possibility were their eyes. "Welcome," said Ezra, though his voice seemed to come from all four brothers simultaneously. "We have been expecting you, and we understand the concerns that have brought you here. You fear what we have become, and you worry about the effects our transformation is having on your community. These are reasonable fears, and we do not dismiss them lightly. As the official representative of Cedar Ridge, the ultimatum that the town had decided upon was delivered by Mayor Harrison. Either return to their normal human condition or leave the area permanently would need to be done by the brothers. The uncertainty and fear that their presence had created could no longer be tolerated by the community." "Mr. Mayor," responded Caleb, his voice joining Ezra's in perfect harmony. "We understand your position, but we must tell you that what you ask is impossible. The transformation we have undergone cannot be reversed any more than a butterfly can return to being a caterpillar. We have moved beyond the boundaries of human existence, and there is no path that leads backward from where we now stand." The spiritual dimensions of the brothers' condition was attempted to be addressed by Reverend Thorne, arguing that their transformation represented a departure from God's intended design for human nature. Biblical passages about the sanctity of the human form and the dangers of seeking knowledge beyond what God had granted to mankind were quoted by him. But fundamental assumptions about the relationship between divine will and human limitation were challenged by the brothers' response. With a voice that seemed to echo from multiple dimensions simultaneously argued Josiah that their transformation represented the fulfillment of humanity's spiritual potential. "Reverend Thorne," Josiah said, his words accompanied by patterns of light that danced across the chapel walls. "You speak of God's design as if it were static and unchanging. But the scriptures themselves promise that human beings are destined for transformation and elevation. We have simply discovered the path that leads to that promised transformation." The medical aspects of the brothers' condition was attempted to be addressed by Dr. Morrison, arguing that their influence on other community members represented a public health threat. But the limitations of approaching their condition through conventional medical frameworks were revealed by the brothers' response. "Dr. Morrison," said Abel, his luminous form casting shifting patterns of light throughout the chapel. "You have documented our transformation with admirable scientific precision, but you continue to evaluate us using criteria designed for ordinary human physiology. We are no longer bound by the limitations that those criteria were created to measure." When Thomas Preston confronted the brothers about their influence on his daughter came the turning point in the confrontation. The philosophical abstractions that had dominated the discussion was broken through by his parental desperation. "I don't care about your theories and theology," Preston said, his voice cracking with emotion. "I care about my little girl. She was normal and happy before you got your hands on her. Now she talks like an adult, knows things no child should know, and looks at me with eyes that seem to see right through to my soul. I want my daughter back the way she was." Both their compassion and the irreversible nature of the changes they had initiated were revealed by the brothers' response. That Sarah's transformation had begun, not when she visited their chapel, but when Josiah had prayed over Timothy Fletcher months earlier was explained by them. That could not be severed had been opened a connection by that prayer. "Thomas," said Ezra, his voice carrying infinite gentleness, "your daughter is not lost to you. She is becoming something that will serve purposes far greater than anything she could achieve within the limitations of ordinary human existence. The love you feel for her will continue to bind you together, even as she evolves beyond normal human classification." But by Sarah herself was provided the resolution that none of the adults had been able to achieve. Forward she stepped and addressed the delegation with clarity that seemed impossible for someone her age. "Papa, Mayor Harrison, Reverend Thorne, Dr. Morrison," she said, her young voice carrying absolute truth. "You're asking the wrong questions. You want to know if what's happening to us is good or bad, safe or dangerous, right or wrong. But those categories don't apply to what we're becoming. We're not better or worse than we were before. We're different in ways that make such comparisons meaningless." To demonstrate their capabilities to prove that their transformation represented expansion rather than loss was then offered by the brothers. Driven by scientific curiosity despite his fear, to the demonstration agreed Dr. Morrison. Evidence that would haunt him for the rest of his life was provided to Morrison by what followed. Around the delegation arranged themselves the brothers and began what they called a consciousness bridge, a process that allowed normal humans to experience temporarily the expanded awareness that had become their permanent condition. For several minutes that seemed to last hours, reality from the brothers' perspective was experienced by Morrison. The thoughts and emotions of every person in Cedar Ridge could be perceived by him, events occurring hundreds of miles away witnessed, and connections between apparently unrelated phenomena that revealed the underlying unity of all existence understood. Simultaneously exhilarating and terrifying was the experience, offering knowledge that no human mind was designed to contain. When the demonstration ended, in ways that would affect him for the rest of his life found himself changed Morrison. That reality was far more complex than conventional science acknowledged had been experienced as proof by him. But that some knowledge was too vast for ordinary human consciousness to process safely had also been discovered by him. Similar experiences had been had by the other members of the delegation. But the price that came with such expansion was also revealed by the demonstration. As their normal consciousness struggled to process information that exceeded its capacity, moments of disorientation were experienced by each member. Through Dr. Morrison's secret analysis of their blood samples was finally revealed the truth about the Blackwood brothers. Instead of normal cells, structures that defied classification, larger than normal, possessing multiple nuclei, and moving with deliberate purpose, were found by him under his microscope. "The blood is alive," Morrison wrote, his handwriting betraying agitation, "not merely containing life, but possessing consciousness that coordinates cellular activities. It's as if their entire circulatory system has become a single thinking organism." That they hadn't survived typhoid fever was discovered by Morrison. They had been transformed by it. Some form of evolutionary adaptation had been triggered by the disease, changing their fundamental biology. Something new had been become by their bodies, existing between life and death. That their transformation had been intentional from the beginning was revealed by the brothers. A calculated ritual based on knowledge discovered in theological studies had been Josiah's prayer over Timothy Fletcher. References to divine communion requiring complete surrender of human flesh to achieve union with the eternal had been found by them. "We are not dying," Caleb said. "We are becoming. This flesh is merely a cocoon and we are emerging as something far greater." Contact with others like themselves throughout history was revealed by the brothers. Individuals who had undergone similar transformations. Of a network of purified vessels working to prepare humanity for some great change they spoke. That the brothers had become something beyond human classification was realized by Morrison. Not alive in traditional sense, but not dead either. In a state medical science could not acknowledge because it challenged fundamental assumptions about life and death they existed. "You can join us," Abel said, his phosphorescent skin pulsing with invitation. "Your scientific mind would be preserved and enhanced." But Morrison, faced with the choice between humanity and transcendence, to remain human chose. Through darkness with desperation, born of absolute terror, he fled the chapel, driving. The beginning of the end for the Blackwood brothers' story was marked by Dr. Morrison's flight from Cedar Ridge. Unable to cope with what he had witnessed, all his research was destroyed by Morrison, his journals burned, and Kansas left forever. In Oregon he settled, where he practiced medicine for another 30 years, but of the Blackwood case to anyone he never spoke. That their presence had become incompatible with the human community they had once served seemed to be understood by the brothers themselves. In the weeks following Morrison's departure, from all contact with their neighbors began to withdraw they. The lights in their chapel, which had been visible across the prairie for months, went dark. The strange harmonies that had echoed from their evening prayers fell silent. On December 15, 1878, the first body was found by Thomas Preston. In the chapel lay Ezra, his transformed flesh already beginning to decompose in ways that followed no known biological process. To glass had turned his golden eyes, and the appearance of ancient parchment had been taken on by his skin. No obvious cause of death was there. He had simply ceased to exist. Over the following days were found the other brothers, each in a different location on the farm. In the wheat fields was discovered Caleb, his body surrounded by a circle of grain that had grown to impossible heights overnight. In the farmhouse library was found Josiah, seated at his desk with a pen in his hand and a blank page before him. In the barn was discovered Abel, his phosphorescent skin still glowing faintly in the darkness. Eager to distance itself from the case, for the brothers to be buried quickly and quietly in the chapel's small cemetery was arranged by the Methodist Church. No autopsy was performed. No official cause of death was recorded, and with simple stones bearing only names and dates were marked the graves. But with their deaths did not end the mystery of the Blackwood brothers. In the years that followed, abandoned was the farm and into ruin fell the chapel. Yet strange lights emanating from the hilltop were reported by travelers passing through the area, and the sound of harmonious voices carrying across the prairie on still nights. To this day remains classified the Kansas State Medical Board sealed report on the case. That the matter be permanently suppressed in the interests of public health and scientific integrity was accepted without question as Dr. Patterson's recommendation. That the Blackwood brothers died of typhoid fever complications and that any reports of unusual symptoms were the result of mass hysteria brought on by the epidemic is the official position. In 1923, by a development company that intended to build a new town on the site was purchased the abandoned Blackwood farm, but feelings of overwhelming dread and strange visions were reported by construction workers who refused to work near the chapel ruins. Abandoned was the project and to the state as a wildlife preserve was eventually donated the land. Closed to the public officially due to environmental concerns remains the preserve, but the real reason is known by local residents. With their deaths may have ended the Blackwood brothers' transformation, but the questions they raised about the nature of human existence, the boundaries between life and death, and the possibility of transcendence through surrender of self, continue to haunt those who know the full story. The Blackwood case is still refused to be acknowledged by modern science, not because the evidence is lacking, but because the implications are too disturbing to contemplate. If real was the brothers' transformation, if something beyond human classification they truly became, then our understanding of biology, consciousness, and the nature of existence itself must be fundamentally reconsidered. That some mysteries are too dangerous to solve is the truth. Some knowledge too terrible to possess. A path to transcendence that required the complete surrender of their humanity was discovered by the Blackwood brothers. And in doing so, something that human society could neither understand nor accept they became. As a warning about the dangers of seeking knowledge that humanity is not prepared to handle serves their story. In their desire to commune directly with the divine, to bypass the limitations of human existence, to forces that transformed them into something that was neither fully alive nor completely dead they opened themselves. Stands empty now the chapel on the hilltop, its windows dark and its doors sealed. But on certain nights, when the wind is still and the moon is dark, for figures standing in the wheat fields are reported by travelers, their faces turned toward the sky as if listening to some distant voice. That the Blackwood brothers' quest for divine communion led them to a destination that science cannot map and religion cannot explain is what we do know. Living proof that there are some thresholds that once crossed cannot be uncrossed and some transformations that are irreversible they became. That the boundaries between life and death, between human and divine may be far more permeable than we imagine is shown to us by this mystery. A way to transcend those boundaries was found by the Blackwood brothers, but their humanity itself was the price they paid. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed? Leave your comment below and share your theories about what really happened to the four brothers. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. The truth is out there waiting for those brave enough to seek it. See you in the next video.